This is chapter 14, part 2. Let's continue on with some more terms. This term resilience is mentioned in the textbook. The textbook defines resilience is the inclination to resist the effect of risk factors for substance abuse through the action of protective factors. Now, if you recall what they mean by risk factors, that's anything that's correlated with, drug abusive behavior, right? So if you're hanging out in a group with people who are drug addicts, that's a risk factor for you abusing drugs. That would be an example of a risk factor. Protective factor is something that's correlated with less abusive behavior, with better behavior. So maybe if you've got, if you've got supportive family who are encouraging you to work, to get away from this problem behavior, that will be an example of a protective factor. So they're saying that sort of the combination, if you've got more protective factors that are stronger than the risk factors, they're defining that as resilience, your kind of ability to resist or bounce back from problem drug use. I myself, that's fine that the textbook wants to define it that way. I want to sort of give an alternative way that I often see resilience defined in public health or research, that it would be defined something along the lines of the ability to bounce back from difficulties. And in this case, the difficulties of maybe problematic drug use, drug dependency, just abusive behavior that you're able to, and then maybe the consequences that come from that. Maybe you get arrested, maybe you spend some time in jail, maybe you lose your job, maybe you lose your girlfriend, your boyfriend, something like that. That the ability to bounce back and to sort of improve your behavior, get back up on your feet and improve your behavior, as opposed to becoming overwhelmed and getting worse from, with this problematic drug use. So resilience can be thought of, in contrast to the textbook, it can be thought of as a personality trait that we differ on one person to the next. Some people bounce back really well. They have the ability to get back up on their feet and start all over again and got the strength and toughness to do that. Other people, as in sort of, an internal characteristic, a personality trait, other people might fall apart and not really necessarily, it's much harder for them to get back up on their feet, may not have the strength to start all over again and pick themselves up and go back at it and fight the good fight against maybe their drug dependency problem. So you can think of it as a personality, more of an internal trait than just thinking of it as your circumstances, good or bad. Both of those, I think, are fine to think of them that way. Again, I tend to see resilience as more of a personality factor when I'm reading the literature. By the way, to show that it makes some sense to think of it as a personality trait, the genetic studies that look at the influence of genes on a characteristic, they measure the genetic influence with this term that I have here, heritability. And what the heritability for resilience is moderate, and the statistic that they usually generate in those studies is somewhere between 0.3 and 0.5. And what we mean by this, what this means is that according to this genetic research, that about 30 to 50% of a person's resilience is the result of the particular combination of genes that person has. So there's moderate genetic influence on your level of resilience. Now that doesn't mean that, when you start talking about genes, some people think that means, well, then there's no way to improve your resilience. It is what it is. That's not right. First of all, this is only a moderate genetic influence, 0.3 to 0.5, which leaves plenty of room for other factors to increase or decrease resilience. But it would be a misinterpretation to think that because there's moderate heritability that somehow people cannot improve their resilience. But it does point to the fact that it's sort of a somewhat stable personality trait. It's somewhat of an internal thing. It's not just your circumstances, good or bad. Substance abuse of some kind accounts for almost one half of all preventable deaths in the United States, either through the abuse of alcohol. 7% of preventable deaths are from alcohol. From tobacco, 38%. That's the real killer. And the one that we're not really going to talk about in this class, the problem of tobacco. But it indeed is a drug, and it is it's not so much of an issue from a criminal justice perspective, but from a perspective of public health, it's a huge one. You can see it's the biggest number here. Illicit drugs, which is more of the focus of this semester, from a public health perspective, is not a big killer. Illicit drugs, 2% of deaths, of preventable deaths in the United States. The big one here clearly is tobacco. Number 2, alcohol, which is a legal drug if you're old enough to drink. So that's an interesting sort of health perspective here. Let me jump down just for a second to give you the graph. Here's the graph. And we can, I list the drugs up above, various types of drugs, and you can see how big tobacco is there on this pie chart. Again, what that means is 38% of the preventable deaths in the United States are due to smoking tobacco or using tobacco. It's the biggest one, bigger than any of these other ones. It's bigger than diet or activity. So under diet activity, I think they would have obesity, and obesity is a big killer. But even diet activity, which is very broad set of and very important factors, is not as big of a factor. It doesn't kill as many people as tobacco does. So that's from a public health perspective, tobacco's big, but also this being a drug and crime class, we should stress the illicit drugs and even the alcohol part of it, which are significant. And then you can see how those compare with other things, like, for example, something that might be relevant for criminal justice, firearms. Firearms are 3% of the deaths. And then just to give you some context, a lot of people die in car accidents, but that still is only 4% of all preventable deaths. So you can see the importance of these drugs, especially tobacco. Let's go back up to where we were. Let's talk about dollars a little bit. The estimated costs of substance abuse in the United States exceed, get this, $1 trillion each year. It's hard to wrap your mind around such huge numbers. Academic underachievement from underage drinking, estimated at $64 billion per year. Drug-related hospital emergency visits, $4 billion. Incarceration of individuals committing drug law offenses, $30 billion. Alcohol-related workplace injuries and absenteeism, $28 billion. And DUI-related collisions, so driving under the influence, and accidents from driving under the influence, $230 billion. So a big chunk of it is driving under the influence. DUIs, or they're calling it here DWIs, driving while intoxicated. So you can see that alcohol figures large in the costs to society, because out of this 1 trillion, you've got quite a few of these where specifically drinking is mentioned. So, according to the economists that are estimating these prices, we're talking about enormous costs to society, and from a public health perspective, especially alcohol. So, alcohol is a big deal, more so than the illegal drugs, although they're certainly part of the story too. It is estimated that more than $18 could be saved for each dollar, right? So you spend $1 on school-based prevention programs, and according to these estimates, again, could be off, who knows whether they're exactly accurate or not, but still the numbers are impressive. You spend $1 on prevention and you get $18 savings with all of these costs up here we're talking about. That those are going to be reduced, and so you're going to save, according to this study, you save $18 for each one that you spend, which would be a huge saving huge savings if it were, assuming it's accurate. Okay, there's that graph again. Go to the next slide. A number of school-based programs have included the teaching of personal and social skills, as well as techniques for resisting forms of social pressure to smoke, drink, or use other drugs, referred to as peer refusal skills. It turns out, according to the research, that it's more effective than just teaching people the dangers of drugs or getting them educated on drug abusive behavior. More effective than that is to teach kids how to be able to say no thanks to being offered drugs and alcohol. And that's more effective, teaching specific skills and techniques of how to refuse, how to say no, is more effective than just telling the kids. Back when I was a kid, in the 80s, they taught us, just say no. That was the slogan of the time. Just say no. If somebody offers you drugs, alcohol, you just say no. Well, that's a little too simple. Sometimes you need to have better skills to be able to turn down the peer pressure that peers may put on you to use drugs. So rather than simply prodding young people to just say no, an approach that is found to have limited success, although they certainly did in the 80s, they did have a big drop in drug use among young people in the 80s, a big drop. So there were certainly effective programs. Certainly something was going right in the 80s to have the big drops that we did see. Programs that concentrate on peer refusal skills enable them to, quote, know how to say no. So that's an important skill. Peer refusal skill training has been shown to reduce the rate of tobacco smoking, which again, public health issue, as well as alcohol drinking and marijuana smoking by 35 to 45%. So those are pretty significant gains, improvements. With respect to tobacco smoking, this approach has been even more effective for young people identified as being in a high-risk category, in that their friends or family are smokers or have been smokers, than for other students. So this is an example of what they call an at-risk group, a group that has a higher risk of beginning to smoking cigarettes. If you have friends who smoke, if you come from a family of smokers, it's particularly effective with those at-risk individuals. Task and social skills training have included the ability to initiate social interactions, introducing oneself to a stranger, offer a compliment to others, engage in conversation, and express feelings and opinions. So it turns out according to the research, that one way to help kids stay away from drugs is to teach them kind of more general social skills, how to deal with other people, how to communicate with other people, how to get more comfortable with people with specific skills. And this, of course, has the big added benefit of not only just helping the kids be able to say no to drugs, but also just learning how to be more social and developing social skills, be able to interact more effectively with other people, which is a huge skill in many different areas and throughout life. So, it's really good if you can come up with programs that help with a specific problem here taking drugs, but at the same time that can help give you skills that can help you in many ways for a very long time into the future. Lessons generally involve a combination of instruction, demonstration, feedback, reinforcement, which by reinforcement they mean like rewarding you for doing, learning the material and mastering the material. Behavioral rehearsal, so kind of role-playing, rehearsing, walking through the kinds of things you would say to be able to avoid, to say no to drugs. And extended practice through behavioral homework assignments. So it's kind of a school situation, but it's more hands-on, more specific, more role-playing, more active, and that seems to help the kids learn these skills more effectively. A related skill is the ability to make decisions in a thoughtful and careful way. Emphasis is placed on the identification of problem situations, the formulation of goals, the generation of alternative solutions, and the consideration of the likely consequences of each. So one of the reasons why this is effective is that if you kind of walk through all these scenarios where you might get offered drugs, that you map out what you would do in the different scenarios. And this is a wise skill to develop on your own and to use in your life, is to anticipate situations you might find yourself in and to plan through what am I going to do, or what set of things am I going to do if I find myself in this situation. Map it out, plan it out beforehand, so when it hits you and you get surprised with it later, you're ready. You already have sort of a plan of that's much, much better than just getting hit with it unprepared. Let's break there. We'll continue on in the next segment.